A former priest was charged with murdering a young woman who went to church to give confession. It took nearly 60 years to bring John Feit to a courtroom.
The prosecutor says it's because...
It was a quiet Wednesday evening, and as usual, Maria America Guerra walked into Sacred Heart Catholic Church in Edinburgh, Texas, for her evening prayers. She knelt at the communion rail. She had no reason to be afraid. The church was still, the kind of stillness that makes you feel safe. Suddenly, the stillness shattered. A man appeared from behind and grabbed her with both hands. He slammed her body so hard to the ground that the air left her lungs completely. Before she could scream, before she could even understand what was happening, he was already on top of her, stuffing a rag in her mouth, trying to silence her. Maria felt helpless and scared, but she refused to be silenced. She turned her head and bit down on his finger, hard, so hard that she tasted his blood in her mouth, and he ran. Maria lay on the floor of that church, shaking, bleeding, terrified, in the exact spot where she had just been speaking to God. She survived. She went to the police. She told them everything. 24 days later, following the same pattern, a similar woman, a similar location, a similar attack. This time, she did not survive. Her name was Irene Garza. Irene Garza was born on the 15th of November 1934 in McAllen, Texas. She was the first Latina drum majorette and twirler at McAllen High School, the first person in her entire family to earn a college degree. And in 1958, she was crowned Miss All South Texas Sweetheart. However, all that mattered most to Irene was being a teacher. Irene was a second-grade teacher at Thigpen Elementary School in McAllen. Her students were some of the most underprivileged children in the area. Most times, she would reach into her own pocket and buy them shoes and school supplies they could not afford.
She would use part of her salary to buy them school supplies, to buy them things that they needed.
And her faith was everything to her.
Every Sunday, she'd go to church?
Every Sunday. Every Saturday, she'd go to confession. It was a little bit of a family thing. Irene's going to confession whether she needs it or not.
Just like every normal Saturday evening. Irene had just finished having dinner with her family, and as the evening came, she decided to go to church for confession. This was not unusual for her, because that was her second home and her safe place. The only unusual thing that night was that Irene never made it back home. That was the last time her parents and sister ever saw her. Let me take you inside that church. Irene arrived at Sacred Heart Catholic Church in her blue car and carefully parked it down the block. The church was packed. It was Easter weekend and people were coming and going everywhere. And the first thing she noticed was that the priest hearing confessions that evening was not the regular parish priest. But this was not unusual. Visiting priests were a normal part of Catholic practice, and Irene thought nothing of it. She walked into the confessional box and began her confession. But before she could finish, the priest stopped her. He ushered her out of the confessional box and led her to the rectory. Now, for anyone who does not know, a rectory is the priest's private home. It is attached to the church, but it is not the church. It is where the priest lives. And this man took a young woman, alone, into his private home. This was not the first time he had done this to Irene. Her close friend Anna Maria Hollingsworth later testified in court that Irene had confided in her just days before her death. She said the priest made her deeply uncomfortable, that he thought he was handsome, and kept insisting she give her confession privately in the rectory rather than in the confessional box. Irene found it strange, but she trusted him. He was a man of God. In 1960, in a deeply Catholic community, you did not question a priest. According to the priest, when confession was over, he watched Irene get up and walk out of the church. That was the last time anyone ever saw Irene Garza alive. Her parents waited for hours. By 3 o'clock in the morning, they could not hold on any longer. They drove to the church. And there was her blue car, parked exactly where she had left it. But Irene was nowhere to be found. Sensing something was deeply wrong, they drove straight to McAllen police station and reported their daughter missing. While families across McAllen were waking up to celebrate the resurrection, Nicholas Garza was at the police station reporting his missing daughter. Word spread through the whole community fast. And because of how deeply loved Irene was, the largest search party in Rio Grande Valley history was immediately launched. 70 members of the Hidalgo County Sheriff's posse on horseback, combing through orange groves and mesquite thickets. 2 Border Patrol planes flying overhead, searching from the air. 65 National Guardsmen deployed on the ground. Skin divers dragging every single irrigation canal in the area. Over 500 people questioned. And yet, no signs of Irene. No leads. Nothing. And then on April 18th, the first clue emerged. A single high-heeled shoe was discovered in a field. A fiancé's brand shoe. It belonged to Irene. The following day, her black patent leather purse was found. And alongside it, part of her white lace veil, her belongings scattered along a road, one by one. Like a trail leading somewhere nobody wanted to go. After 4 agonizing days of the whole community desperately trying to put the pieces together, the Garza family received a phone call. The voice on the other end claimed to be Irene. She said she was alive, that she had been kidnapped and taken to a hotel in nearby Hidalgo. Police launched their investigation immediately, and Nicholas and Josefina Garza, who had not slept, who had barely eaten, who had spent 4 days not knowing where their daughter was, jumped for joy. Not after 4 days of complete silence, they were finally hearing their daughter's voice saying she was alive and coming home. But that joy did not last long. The police came back with the devastating news. The call was completely fake. To this day, nobody knows who made that call. But it was not Irene. On April 21st, 1960, a body was found, face down in an irrigation canal on 2nd Street in McAllen. It was Irene Garza. She was fully clothed. Her blouse had been unbuttoned. Her shoes and underwear were missing. The autopsy told investigators everything they needed to know, and everything the Garza family never wanted to hear. Irene had been struck with a blunt object, knocked completely unconscious. While she was unconscious, she was sexually assaulted. And then, she was suffocated to death. A devout woman, a beauty queen, a beloved teacher who simply went to church, and death followed her there. The hunt for whoever did this began immediately, and the very first piece of evidence was a heavy metallic Kodak slide photo viewer found right alongside Irene's body in that canal. Authorities made a public announcement, asking if anyone could identify who the viewer belonged to. A few days later, a man came forward and claimed it. And when investigators looked at who that man was, everything changed. It was a priest, and he had absolutely no explanation for how his slide viewer ended up in the canal where Irene Garza's body was found. His name was Father John Feit, a 27-year-old visiting priest from San Antonio, fresh out of seminary training. He had only arrived in McAllen in June 1959, barely a year before Irene disappeared. He was young, he was new, and nobody in that community really knew him well. Investigators would soon find out exactly who Father John Feit was, and what they discovered changed everything. The morning after Irene disappeared, Easter Sunday, Father Feit celebrated Mass at Sacred Heart Church as normal, as if nothing had happened, as if a young woman had not vanished from his rectory the night before. But his fellow priests noticed something: scratches, deep scratch marks on both of Father Feit's hands. When they questioned him about it, he told them he had locked himself out of his residence the night before and scratched himself climbing back through a window. No one doubted his story because he was a trusted man of God. The police brought Father Feit in for questioning, And what happened in that room was deeply revealing. His story kept changing. First, he told investigators he had never heard Irene's confession in the rectory at all. He said he had directed her to another priest. Then, when investigators pushed him, he changed his story completely. He admitted he had taken her to the rectory, that he had heard her confession privately, behind closed doors. The inconsistency was impossible to ignore. So he was asked to take a polygraph test. During that test, the examiner noticed something deeply disturbing. Father Feit was actively trying to control his own breathing, deliberately and consciously trying to manipulate his body's responses to the questions being asked. And when the official report came back, it stated that Father Feit was responding in a manner that would indicate beyond doubt that he was concealing facts. As if that was not chilling enough, during that same polygraph test, Father Feit was heard loudly saying, "There will never be any evidence that comes out, and what you have is not enough to convict me." He said that, out loud, to the polygraph examiner, while being questioned about the murder of Irene Garza, unaware that Maria America Guerra remembered everything. Because while investigators were building their case against Father Feit, they made a discovery that connected two crimes sitting 3 weeks apart. Maria America Guerra, the young woman who escaped her attacker while praying at Sacred Heart Church in Edinburgh, Texas. And after Irene's murder, Maria America Guerra was shown a police lineup, and without a single moment of hesitation, she pointed at one man, Father John Bernard Feit, the same man who had just come forward to claim the slide viewer found next to Irene's body. The same man who had taken Irene into his private rectory behind closed doors. The same man with unexplained scratches on both hands the morning after Irene disappeared. The same man whose story kept changing every time investigators pushed him. One man, two churches, two women, 3 weeks apart. But here is what made this case so deeply frustrating. Despite every piece of evidence connecting Father Feit to Irene's murder, he was never convicted, because the evidence was not strong enough. No DNA technology existed in 1960, but not a single witness had seen him with Irene after she entered that rectory. They had suspicion. They had circumstantial evidence. They had a polygraph that said beyond doubt he was lying. But they did not have enough. And Father John Bernard Feit, the man who attacked Maria America Guerra in a church and paid $500, was about to walk free again. And the reason he walked free was the very institution Irene Garza had trusted with her life. The Garza family were convinced Father Feit was responsible. And being the deeply devoted Catholic family that they were, they went straight to the church for answers. Father O'Brien, the assistant pastor at Sacred Heart Church at that time, sat down with them and made them a promise. He told them the church was fully aware of the situation, and that Father Feit would be dealt with internally, that he would be sent away and kept far from the public. In 1960 in McAllen, Texas, a deeply Catholic family did not question a priest. The church was above question, above scrutiny, above the law in the minds of that community. So the Garza family bowed their heads and trusted that God's house would deliver the justice that the courts had failed to provide. They were wrong. Rather than being handed to the police, rather than facing a murder charge, Father John Feit was quietly and discreetly transferred by the Catholic Church to Assumption Abbey, a Trappist monastery in Conception, Missouri. Not a prison cell, a monastery, like a peaceful religious retreat where he would pray and live among fellow men of God. While Irene Garza's family buried their daughter and waited for justice that was never going to come. That was not punishment. That was protection. But no matter how far you run, your past will always find you. Because at that monastery, guilt was eating Father Feit alive. A former monk named Dale Tashiny had been assigned to counsel troubled young priests at Assumption Abbey. And one day, Father John Feit sat across from him, and he told him everything, in detail. He described exactly what he had done to Irene Garza inside that rectory. He described assaulting her, binding her, gagging her, suffocating her, dumping her body in the canal. He told Tchenny the last words that Irene Garza ever spoke. "I can't breathe. I can't breathe." Dale Tackney sat with that confession. And he said nothing. He was bound by his religious obligations. In that world, what was spoken in confidence stayed in confidence. So he carried that secret completely alone, for 39 years. Meanwhile, life moved on beautifully for Father John Feit. In 1972, he left the priesthood entirely. He moved across the country to the Phoenix, Arizona area. He met a woman, fell in love, got married, had 3 children. He became a devoted husband, a loving father, a respected member of his community. He worked at a Catholic charity called Saint Vincent de Paul, training volunteers and helping oversee food pantries for people in need. He was there for 17 years, and he even became a grandfather. Not a single person around him knew that back in McAllen, Texas in 1960, he had taken a young woman into a private room, assaulted her, suffocated her, and dumped her body in a canal. He had simply moved on. While in McAllen, Texas, Irene's family never stopped fighting. They knocked on every door. They wrote every letter. They refused to let the world forget her name. But sadly, sometime in the 1990s, both of Irene's parents passed away, Nicholas and Josefina Garza, the 2 people who had driven to the police station at 3 o'clock in the morning, the 2 people who had jumped for joy when they thought they heard their daughter's voice on the phone, only to be told it was a hoax. They died without ever seeing a single day of justice for Irene. They had trusted the church. They had waited their whole lives, and they died still waiting. Nicholas Garza is buried right beside his daughter Irene at Valley Memorial Gardens in McAllen, Texas. Father and daughter, together in death as they were in life. Then in 2001, a local McAllen cable television show called Open Files aired an episode about the unsolved murder of Irene Garza. For the first time in years, the case was back in the public eye. The new McAllen Police Chief Victor Rodriguez watched that episode, and something in him said, enough is enough. He picked up the phone and contacted the Texas Rangers Cold Case Unit. He asked them to come in and look at everything with completely fresh eyes. And that, 41 years after Irene Garza walked into Sacred Heart Catholic Church and never came home, is where the road to justice finally began. In 2002, the case was reopened. For the first time in 41 years, investigators went back in with fresh eyes. And what happened next, nobody could have predicted. 2 men came forward, independently, without knowing the other had spoken. The first was Dale Tackney, the monk who had been carrying Feit's confession since 1963. After 39 years of silence, he could not take it anymore. He wrote a letter to the police detailing everything Feit had confessed to him. The second was Father Joseph O'Brien, the assistant pastor who had been at Sacred Heart Church the very night Irene disappeared. He told investigators that shortly after the murder, he had confronted Feit directly. He had looked him in the eye and asked, "Did you kill Irene Garza?" And Feit told him everything. 2 men, never spoken to each other, telling the exact same story. Everything was taken to the district attorney, Irene Garza, and he said no. When a journalist asked him if the case would ever be solved, he said, "I guess if you believe that pigs can fly, anything is possible." For anyone not familiar with that expression, pigs cannot fly. It means something is completely impossible. That is what the district attorney said about the murder of Irene Garza. To a journalist, on the record, Irene's family refused to accept it. They pushed, they fought. They made enough noise that in 2004, Guerra was finally forced to bring the case before a grand jury. But he never called Feit to testify. He never called Dale Tacheny. He never called Father O'Brien. The three most important people in the entire case, none of them walked into that room. The grand jury voted not to indict, and in 2005, Father O'Brien died, age 77, without ever testifying. His account gone forever. It seemed like justice for Irene Garza was never going to come. Then in 2013, a CNN journalist knocked on Feit's door in Arizona and asked him directly on camera, "Did you commit the murder of Irene Garza?" Feit looked straight into the camera and said, "Interesting question. The answer is no." The story went national. Millions of people heard Irene's name for the first time. And in Hidalgo County, people had finally had enough. In 2014, Rene Guerra lost his re-election, voted out after decades in office. A new district attorney named Ricardo Rodriguez took his place. And he came in with one promise: justice for Irene Garza. And unlike everyone before him, he meant it. The moment Ricardo Rodriguez took office in 2015, he opened a fresh investigation into the murder of Irene Garza. New investigators, new forensic techniques, new evidence uncovered. And after 14 months of painstaking work, on February 23, 2016, police flew to Arizona. They drove to a quiet neighborhood in Scottsdale. They knocked on the door of a modest house, and John Feit, 83 years old, opened the door. He needed a walker just to stand up straight. He was placed under arrest and charged with the first-degree murder of Irene Garza, 56 years after he took her life. The law had finally found him. And when he stood before a judge for the very first time, this man who had lived freely for over half a century looked at the court and said, "This whole thing makes no sense to me." Because the crime in question took place in 1960. The trial began in late November 2017 in Edinburgh, Texas, the same courthouse where 55 years earlier, he had paid his $500 fine for attacking Maria America Guerra and walked out a free man. He was 85 years old, sitting at the defense table, completely expressionless. Like this was all just a minor inconvenience in his otherwise comfortable life. The prosecutor stood up and looked the jury in the eye. "He is a wolf in priest's clothing." The prosecution laid out everything methodically. The slide viewer found in the canal next to Irene's body. The scratches on his hands the morning after she disappeared. His changing and inconsistent story. The failed polygraph. The attack on Maria America Guerra just 3 weeks before Irene's murder. One by one, piece by piece, the picture of a predator became impossible to ignore. And then, Dale Tacheny took the stand, 90 years old, carrying this secret for 54 years. He sat in that witness box and told the jury in painful detail exactly what Father Feit had confessed to him at that monastery in 1963.
Did you know her parents?
No, but I knew she had parents.
That Feit had pulled Irene by the arm out of the confessional, that he had taken her to the rectory, that he had assaulted her, bound her, gagged her, kept her hidden. And then he told the jury the last words that Irene Garza ever spoke. "I can't breathe. I can't breathe." The courtroom went completely silent. Not a sound, not a movement, just silence. The defense tried everything to tear Tacheny apart. They said he was too old, that his memory could not be trusted after 54 years, that his account was unreliable. But Dale Tacheny sat in that witness box, steady, clear, and completely unshakable. He had waited 54 years to say what he had to say. Nobody was stopping him now. On December 7th, 2017, the jury retired to deliberate. 6 hours and 20 minutes later, they came back. At 8:17 in the evening, in a Hidalgo County courtroom, the verdict was read. John Feit, guilty, life in prison. He sat completely still as those words were read. Not a flicker, not a tear, not a single sign of remorse. Outside the courthouse, Irene's family held each other and wept. And her cousin looked straight into the cameras and said, "Pigs are flying tonight." And then, during the trial, something emerged that changed everything. Not just about Father John Bernard Feit, but about the institution that had stood behind him all along. The prosecution presented a letter, dated October 1st, 1960, written just months after the murder, by a Catholic Church official. That letter was not about justice. It was not about Irene. It was not about doing the right thing. It recommended that the prosecution be made to see how weak their case was, and that Father Feit be quietly transferred as a normal routine transfer. The church knew. They knew what he did, and their response was to protect him. The prosecutors said it plainly in open court. The institution who is in the business of seeking salvation for others was complicit in covering up this murder, and it gets worse. After shielding Feit, the church gave him a position overseeing other troubled priests. And one of the men Feit personally cleared for placement in another parish was a priest named James Porter. James Porter went on to sexually assault more than 100 victims before he was finally defrocked and sent to prison. 100 people. Because the church chose its own reputation over a murdered woman's justice. This was never just about one priest in one small town in Texas. This was about an institution that looked at Irene Garza, a devout Catholic woman who trusted that church with her life and chose to protect itself instead. Irene Garza paid for that choice with her life. On February 13th, 2020, John Bernard Feit died in prison, age 87, cardiac arrest. He was still appealing his conviction when he died. He never apologized. He never showed remorse, not once. He died exactly as he had lived for 57 years, pretending that man no longer existed. But here is what he could never take away. Irene Garza existed. She was real. She was loved. She was a beauty queen and a teacher and a woman of extraordinary faith who spent her own wages buying shoes for children who had none. She walked into her church on Easter, Saturday 1960, trusting she was safe. 57 years later, justice found the man who took her life. Her name was Irene Garza, and now the whole world knows it.